In the British Museum, in a room that sees fewer visitors than it deserves, there is a small glass case. Inside it sits a fragment of manuscript, not a scroll, not a codex, but a piece of parchment. It is written in Syriac, which is a script descended from Aramaic, which is one of the oldest alphabets the world has ever produced. The parchment is worn at the edges, the way old things become worn not from neglect but from handling, from being passed between careful hands over many years, many lifetimes. In places the ink has faded to a warm amber. In other places it is still dark, still legible, still precise in a way that suggests the person who made the marks believed they mattered. Most ancient fragments don't have titles. That is one of the more disorienting things about working with old manuscripts. Most of what survives arrives anonymously, a scrap of a larger whole, with no way of knowing what book it came from, or who wrote it, or why someone thought it worth copying. The fragment simply sits there, incomplete, and the rest of it is gone. This one is different. This one announces itself. It carries a title, and that title, translated into English, reads, "Names of the Wives of the Patriarchs," according to the Hebrew books called Jubilees. Let that settle for a moment, in whatever quiet you have found tonight. You are imagining, or you are looking at, a document whose entire and sole purpose is to supply names. Names that a much older, much more famous book neglected to provide. The wives of Noah, the mothers of the patriarchs, the women whose sons and daughters became the nations of the earth. A long time ago, someone sat down and thought, these women should not be nameless, and they made sure they weren't. Remember that fragment. Remember its title. It comes back at the very end of the night, because Genesis is full of holes like that. And once you start to see them, you really cannot stop. Who was Cain's wife? Genesis tells you he had one. Chapter 4, verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. That is all the introduction she receives. No name, no backstory, no acknowledgement that an explanation might be warranted. The text has spent the last 4 chapters establishing, very carefully, that the only human beings alive are Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Abel is dead, killed by Cain in the preceding verses. And then, without a pause, without any sense that a question has been raised that might require an answer, Cain knew his wife. She is simply there, emerging from the space between sentences, as if the space were a door. How long were Adam and Eve in the garden before the serpent arrived? A week? A century? 1,000 years? You can read chapters 2 and 3 very slowly, slowly enough to feel each sentence land, to notice the texture of the prose, to follow every movement of the narrative.
Theirs was a time of wandering,
and you will not find a
swift
duration.
Journey through the wilderness
The garden is
towards
planted.
the promised land,
Adam is placed
guided
in
by
it.
the setting
The
sun.
animals come to be named. Eve is created. The serpent arrives. The fruit is eaten. The whole sequence moves at the same extraordinary speed with which Genesis moves through everything, and the questions it leaves behind pile up quietly in its wake, unanswered. Who were the mothers of the sons whose sons became the 12 tribes? Why does Genesis tell us Abraham left Ur, left his homeland, his city, his father's house, everything he knew, without explaining why? What did the angels do before humanity existed? What happened in the garden on the days between the naming of the animals and the morning the serpent came? The Bible moves on, at speed, leaving the reader standing in the gap. And in the 2nd century before Christ, sometime around 160 BC, in Judea, in circumstances we cannot fully reconstruct, somebody sat down and answered every one of those questions, all of them, in order, with dates. The result is called the Book of Jubilees. It retells the entire story from the creation of the world to the moment Moses receives the law on Mount Sinai. The same events, the same people, the same sequence, but with every gap filled in, Every name supplied, every missing duration given a number. Cain's wife has a name. Noah's wife has a name. Adam and Eve were in the garden for exactly 7 years before the serpent came. The angels were created on the very first day, and they kept the first Sabbath in heaven, in the presence of God, before any human being had been formed from the dust, before any human being could have understood what a Sabbath was. Every event in the book is dated, to the year, to the week of years, to the Jubilee period, in a continuous calendar running from the first morning of the world. It is Genesis, rewritten by someone who could not stand not knowing. And here is the detail that turns this from an interesting ancient footnote into a whole long night. When the caves above the Dead Sea were opened, beginning in 1947, this book was inside them. Not one copy, not two, around 15, spread across 5 separate caves, the majority in Cave 4 alone, which makes the Book of Jubilees one of the most attested texts in that entire extraordinary library. More copies than most of the books that eventually made it into the Bible itself. Someone didn't just read this, they kept reading it. They wore copies out, they made new ones. They kept them in 5 different caves. So tonight, what does the Book of Jubilees actually add to Genesis? Who wrote it, and what did they claim it was? Why did one community in the Judean desert treasure it above almost everything else they owned? And what was the real reason it was written? Because it wasn't simple curiosity, not primarily, and the answer has been waiting all night inside a single 3-digit number. Close your eyes if you'd like. You don't need to follow every word tonight. This is a long, slow walk through a very old book, 2,000 years old at minimum, and the story it retells is older still. You can drift in the middle of a chapter and come back later. You can fall asleep somewhere in the 2nd century before Christ and wake up in a cave above the Dead Sea, and that will be exactly right. Some nights you'll catch every detail. Some nights you'll catch only the shape of things. Both are fine. That is what this is for. This is for the ones who read something ancient and immediately want to know what happened in the gap. For the ones who notice when a story moves too quickly past a name, or a year, or a woman who deserved a better introduction. For the quiet minds who sense, reading any very old text, that the official record is always a little shorter than the actual story. That somewhere just outside the frame, there is a person the text forgot to name. If that is you tonight, you are in exactly the right place. Before we go any further, where in the world are you tonight? And what hour is it where you are? I want to know. Leave it in the comments. I read them in the mornings, and there is something that I find genuinely moving about knowing that someone in Nairobi, and someone in Edinburgh, and someone in a city I've never visited are all, right now, in the same slow, curious, half-dark place, listening to the same old story. Tell me where you are. Tell me what hour belongs to you tonight. And if it feels right, the like button, the subscribe, it helps in ways that are hard to explain, entirely optional. Being here is already more than enough. Let's begin with what we actually know, with the bedrock, the verifiable, the things that every scholar across every position in these debates would agree on if you asked them in the same room. Genesis is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human writing, not simply because of what it contains, but because of how much it manages to contain in so little space. The sheer compression of material across those opening chapters is unlike anything else in the ancient world. The first 11 chapters carry the reader from the very beginning of the cosmos through the creation of light, the separation of the primordial waters, the appearance of dry land, the making of the sun and moon and stars, the creation of every living thing, the shaping of humanity from dust and breath, the first act of disobedience, the first murder, a genealogy running through 10 generations of men who lived for 900 years or more, the great flood that covered the mountains, the survival of 8 people and every remaining species in a wooden boat, the slow retreat of the waters, and the emergence of the new earth, a covenant signified by a rainbow, another genealogy spreading into the 70 nations of the world, the building of a tower meant to touch heaven, and the dispersal of humanity across the face of the earth in languages they had never spoken before. 11 chapters. In a modern Bible, 11 chapters of Genesis takes up perhaps 20 or 25 pages, and in those pages, all of the above. The text moves at a pace that can only be called extraordinary, narrative that covers the creation of the universe in a paragraph, that moves from the birth of civilization to the beginning of the Hebrew people in fewer pages than a long magazine article. This is not an accident. It is not carelessness or haste or a failure of storytelling. The editors and scribes and priests who shaped what we now call the Hebrew Bible, who shaped it over many centuries, in dialogue with older traditions, in conversation with the needs of the community that would use what they produced, were making deliberate, careful choices about what to include and what to leave out. They were writing sacred history, not biography, not census record, not the kind of court chronicle that a royal administration might keep. The point was the theological arc, the movement from creation toward covenant, from the first human beings toward the people of Israel. The names of the women along the way, the durations of time spent in particular places, the explanations for puzzling narrative gaps. These were not the point. They were the white space around the point. The result is a text of tremendous power and tremendous compression. And, if you read it slowly enough, if you give it the attention that this kind of night is designed for, the patient and unhurried reading that doesn't rush past anything, what you start to feel is tremendous silence. Take a moment with that, right now, if you can. Imagine picking up the book of Genesis and reading chapter 4 very slowly. Not skimming it, not following the narrative at speed, but reading the way you might read a letter someone wrote you that matters, sentence by sentence, giving each sentence the pause it deserves before moving to the next.
The earth was
you feel
without
your way
form
through
and
verse
void,
1, the birth
and
of Cain,
darkness was over
verse
the face
2,
of the
the
deep.
birth of Abel. You follow the offerings in verse 3, the divine preference in verse 4, the anger and the warning and the murder in verses 5 through 8. You arrive at verse 16, where Cain goes away to the land of Nod, east of Eden. You take the breath of that departure, and then in verse 17 you arrive at the sentence, Cain knew his wife. Something in you stops. Not dramatically, not the way you stop when something frightening happens, more the way you stop when you notice something in the corner of a room that you can't quite identify. A small arrest of attention, a sense that the ground is not quite level where you thought it was. The wife is simply there, present without introduction, requiring no explanation, as if the reader had already been told about her and might have forgotten. But the reader has not been told. The text has told you, carefully and in detail, about Adam and Eve and their children, and no wife has been mentioned, and now there is one. And Genesis moves on, as it always does. Scholars have been noticing these gaps for a very long time, noticing them, cataloguing them, arguing about what they mean and what should be done about them. By the 2nd century before Christ, roughly the period when the Book of Jubilees was written, a significant literary tradition had already grown up specifically around filling them in. Scholars today call this tradition Rewritten Bible, and it was a recognized, respected, entirely mainstream practice in the ancient Jewish world. The idea was not to contradict a sacred text, it was to complete it. You took the existing story and expanded it, answering the questions the compression had left open, naming the unnamed figures, harmonizing the details that seemed to sit in tension with each other, supplying the motivations and durations and explanations that the original had omitted. You were not imposing foreign material on something holy. You were restoring what the compression had taken away. Jubilees is the most systematic surviving example of this practice. more thorough, more comprehensive, more rigorously organized than anything else that has come down to us from this period. And it was written with a very specific architecture, a framework of Jubilee periods and weeks of years that imposed a precise chronological structure on every event it described. The word Jubilee in this context needs a brief explanation because it is doing a great deal of work. In the ancient Jewish legal tradition, a Jubilee year occurred every 50 years, a year of release, in which land returned to its original family, debts were cancelled, and slaves went free. But the Jubilee year was the culmination of a counting system that began smaller. 7 days make a week, 7 weeks of days make 7 weeks, 7 years make a week of years, sometimes called a sabbatical year. 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, 49 years, make a Jubilee period. The 50th year is the Jubilee itself. In Jubilees, this counting system is the skeleton of all history. Every event is placed not merely in a year, but in a specific week of years within a specific Jubilee period, running from the first day of creation. Year 1 of the first week of the first Jubilee, the creation. Year 1 of the first week of the second Jubilee, something else, and so on, continuously, without interruption, forward through the narrative. The calendar of the book is the argument of the book. Time has a structure, and the structure was designed. The book was written in Hebrew. We know this now with certainty, thanks to what was found in the caves. In Judea, probably in the decade of the 160s BC, though the scholarly discussion of the exact date continues. It was written for people who already knew Genesis by heart. It assumed that the reader was familiar with the text being retold. It was not an introduction to Genesis, it was a second engagement with Genesis. Slower, more complete, more willing to linger in the spaces the original had moved past. For most of the centuries between its writing and the modern era, this book was unknown to the Western and Near Eastern scholarly traditions. It was not destroyed, not suppressed, not hidden away in a conspiracy of silence, simply lost, the way books are lost when the communities that valued them no longer exist to preserve them, when the language a book was written in falls out of use, when the particular circumstances that made a text essential pass away, lost, as so many things are lost, through the ordinary attrition of time. There is a version of this loss that happens in every family. Documents that were kept by someone who knew why they mattered and stopped being kept by people who didn't. A letter in a language nobody who survived could read. A journal that was bundled away with the furniture when the house was sold and never found again. An account of something important in handwriting that nobody living could decipher, waiting in an archive for someone who already knew what to look for. The loss of books across centuries is the same thing at a different scale. Not deliberate destruction, but the ordinary failure of continuity, the gap that opens between the person who understood why something mattered and the generation that came after. There is a version of this loss that is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it has a texture that is easy to miss when you describe it in abstract terms. Think about what it would have required, concretely, for this book to disappear. Not a dramatic burning or banning. Those are rare, and often counterproductive, making suppressed texts more interesting rather than less. What actually happened was much simpler. The communities in the Jewish world, for whom Jubilees was urgently necessary, eventually stopped existing, or changed in ways that made the book less central. The Jewish rabbinic tradition that emerged after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD organized itself around the oral Torah, the rabbinic discussions and legal rulings, the traditions of interpretation, a tradition in which Jubilees played no formal role. The text was not condemned, it was simply not included in the discussions that mattered. And gradually, the Hebrew manuscripts that had existed were not replaced when they wore out, because the communities that would have replaced them had reorganized around other texts. the book became unread in Hebrew. And when a book is unread long enough, the manuscripts stop being copied. And when the manuscripts stop being copied, the old ones deteriorate, and eventually there are none. The Greek translation survived longer, in fragments, in citations, in passages quoted by early Christian writers who had access to sources that later writers did not. But the complete Greek text is also gone. What the Greek fragments tell us is that the translation was made, that it circulated, that it was read. They don't tell us when it stopped being read or where the last complete copy went. All of that, the Hebrew original and the Greek translation, was lost, not hidden, not destroyed, simply no longer maintained. Jubilees survived in one complete form, in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. In that tradition, the Book of Jubilees is not a curiosity, not a scholarly footnote, not a historical artifact to be studied rather than lived with. It is scripture, canonical, read in the liturgy, copied in monasteries, given the same reverence that the books of Genesis and Exodus receive in other traditions. The Ethiopian Church calls it Metzhafe Kufale, the Book of Division, and has read it continuously for 2,000 years. When European scholars in the 19th century discovered that it existed, the excitement was genuine. They knew it from citations. Early Christian writers had quoted from it, referred to it, occasionally argued against it, and from fragments of Greek and Latin translation embedded in other texts. But the complete document was in Ge'ez, in Ethiopia, and it took time before the manuscripts became available to the wider scholarly world. When they did, what scholars found was a text that had answered, systematically and at length, every question they had ever wanted to ask about the early chapters of Genesis. And then, in 1947, the caves opened. A young Bedouin shepherd, looking for a lost animal near the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a cave opening and heard pottery breaking. He came back the next day. Inside the cave, in clay jars, were ancient leather scrolls. That first discovery grew, over the following decade, into the most significant manuscript find in modern archaeological history. 11 caves, thousands of fragments, texts from the Hebrew Bible, from sectarian rulebooks, from hymns and calendars and legal treatises, and apocalyptic visions and commentaries, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among the fragments were pieces of a Hebrew text that scholars identified quickly. It was Jubilees. A French Dominican priest and archaeologist named Roland Deveau published the first fragment identification in 1949. As the excavations continued, as Cave 4 was opened in 1952 and proved to be the most productive of all, yielding more textual material than all the other caves combined, pieces of Jubilees kept appearing, in different handwriting, in different states of preservation, from different decades of copying, the same text reproduced again and again. When the work of identification and counting was complete, which took decades of painstaking scholarship, the number stood at approximately 15 manuscripts of Jubilees across 5 different caves, possibly 16. The precise count depends on how the most fragmentary pieces are assessed, but 15 is the working consensus. Hold that number lightly. We planted it here, at around the 12-minute mark, and we will come back to its full significance, later in the night. 15. Keep it somewhere you can find it when we need it. The structure of the book is organized around a very specific calendar, the most important detail about it, the detail that explains everything, the detail we will spend the deepest part of tonight on. Every event in the retelling is dated not merely to a year, but to the week of years within the Jubilee period, in a continuous count from the first day of creation. The framing of the whole book is a dialogue on Mount Sinai. God instructs the angel of the presence, one of the most senior figures in the celestial hierarchy, to dictate to Moses the complete history of everything that has happened since the beginning. Moses listens and writes. What Moses writes is the Book of Jubilees. That framing matters, more than it might appear to at first. We'll give it the attention it deserves in a little while. But first, the gaps, and what this book puts in them. Begin with the garden. In Genesis, the Garden of Eden occupies chapters 2 and 3, the central and most intimate chapters of the whole opening of the Bible. And even there, the narrative moves with the speed that characterizes everything in those early pages. The garden is planted, Adam is placed in it, the animals are brought before him to be named. Eve is created, the serpent arrives, the fruit is eaten, they are expelled. The entire sequence, from the planting of the garden to the expulsion from it, takes less than 2 full chapters. And Genesis gives you no sense at all of how much time elapsed during the events it describes. You could read those chapters and imagine the garden existed for a single week before the serpent came. You could imagine it lasting 10,000 years. The text simply does not tell you. It moves through the events with the economy of someone who has a great deal more story still to tell and cannot afford to slow down. Jubilees gives you a number: 7 years. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve lived in the garden for exactly 7 years before the serpent came. 7 years before the temptation. 7 years before the fruit. 7 full years of Eden, undisturbed, complete, before the first thing in human history went wrong. The text is not approximate about this. It dates the serpent's arrival to the garden's 7th year, and it provides the date of the expulsion that follows with the same careful precision it applies to every other event in the narrative. Let that settle at its own pace. Where Genesis gives you silence, Jubilees gives you 7 years. 7 years of Adam and Eve in a world that hadn't broken yet. 7 years of waking up each morning in a place where the air was good and the water ran clear, and the living things around them were still newly named, the names still fresh in the mouth, still mapping onto creatures that had never been named before. 7 years of the afternoon light moving through whatever grew there, of the 4 rivers running outward from the center of the garden to water the 4 quarters of the earth. 7 years of a life that required no labor, no strategy, no planning against scarcity, a life that was simply given, fully and without condition. 7 years in which the world was whole. You can sit with that image for a moment, if you want. You don't have to move on immediately. That is one of the gifts of this kind of night. There is no hurry, no next appointment, no reason not to stay with a picture that deserves more than a passing glance. 7 years of Eden, the light in the garden at the end of the 6th year, the day before the 7th began. The silence of it, whatever grew there, in full fruit, undisturbed. A world that was, for the only time in its history, exactly what it was supposed to be. And then, in the 7th year, the serpent. Why 7? In the world of the Book of Jubilees, 7 is not an arbitrary choice. It is not a round number selected for simplicity or symbolic elegance. 7 is the number of days in the week that ends with the Sabbath, the holy rest that Jubilees places at the absolute structural center of creation. 7 is the fundamental unit from which all larger sacred time periods are built. 7 years make a week of years. 7 weeks of years, 49 years, make a Jubilee period. 7 is woven into the structure of time itself, in the same way that certain numbers are woven into the structure of mathematics, not invented, not imposed from outside, but discovered, intrinsic, part of what time is. To say that the fall happened in the 7th year of the garden is to say that it happened at the completion of a full cycle, at the end of the first week of years in the first Jubilee, not randomly or casually or at an arbitrary point in an unstructured sequence, but at a meaningful and calculated position in a system that runs from the first moment of creation to the last. This choice of number tells you something essential about the mind that wrote this book. Nothing in Jubilees is dated because the author happened to know the date. Everything is dated because the dating is the argument. Time has a shape. History has a structure. The events of sacred history are not randomly distributed across an undifferentiated flow of time. They occupy specific positions in a grid that was designed before the world began, that runs on the 7-beat rhythm of the Sabbath week, and that anyone who knows the system can read. Hold the 7 years, we'll come back to them. Now, the text does something next that is even more striking than the dating of the garden. Jubilees doesn't only give you the garden with a clock on it, it gives you what happened before the garden, on the very first day of creation, in more detail than Genesis provides. On the first day, according to Jubilees, God created not only light and darkness and the division of the primordial waters. God created the angels, all of them, on the first day, in full hierarchical order. The angels of the presence, the most senior class, the ones who stand in the direct proximity of God, are created first. Then the angels of sanctification, a rank below them. Then angels who govern the specific forces of the natural world, wind and clouds, darkness and snow, hail and frost, thunder and lightning, cold and heat, the seasons and the tides. The celestial hierarchy is fully in place on the very first morning of existence, before the sun or the moon, or the dry land, or any living creature. And then, on the 7th day, those angels keep the first Sabbath. They rested. On the 7th day of the first week, in the full presence of God, the angels observed the Sabbath, the holy rest, the cessation from work, the day set apart from the other 6, before any human being existed to do the same. The text is emphatic about this. It says it plainly and deliberately. The Sabbath was observed in heaven before Adam was formed from the dust of the earth. Think carefully about what this means. The Sabbath, which we tend to think of as an institution given to humanity through Moses at Sinai, a commandment, a legal requirement, a practice adopted because the law required it, is in Jubilees something much older and more fundamental than that. It is a cosmic institution, older than humanity, written into the structure of creation itself. The angels rested on the 7th day, not because they were commanded to by the Mosaic law, which wouldn't be given for thousands of years. They rested because the 7th day is holy in itself, holy in the structure of time, holy not because God later commanded human beings to treat it that way, but holy before any human being existed to receive any command at all. You cannot negotiate with this. You cannot argue that, given changing circumstances, the Sabbath might be observed differently, on a different day, or in a modified form, or not at all in certain situations. The Sabbath was kept by the angels in heaven before humanity existed to observe it. It is not a custom, or a tradition, or a legal convention. It is part of the architecture of creation itself, as intrinsic to the structure of the week as the existence of a 7th day. The same logic applies, in Jubilees, to every festival in the sacred calendar. Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Day of Atonement, Tabernacles. None of these festivals in Jubilees are historical institutions established by Moses in response to the specific events of the Exodus. They are ancient in the deepest sense, older than the Exodus, older than Moses, older than the covenant at Sinai. In Jubilees, Noah celebrates Passover. Abraham observes the Feast of Weeks and knows what it signifies. The patriarchs keep the full festival calendar, correctly and carefully, generations before Moses was born. Because the festivals are not Moses' invention, they are the natural rhythm of a universe designed, from the first moment of creation, by someone who counted in sevens. Notice what the author has done. By showing the patriarchs observing the festivals centuries before Sinai, Jubilees has made those practices independent of the Mosaic covenant. They do not derive their authority from the Exodus. They do not depend on the historical events at Sinai for their validity. They predate all of that. They were being observed by Noah after the flood. They were being celebrated by Abraham in Canaan. And if they predate Moses, then the authority to modify them does not rest with any later legal tradition, no matter how learned or how established. The festivals are as old as the Sabbath. The Sabbath is as old as the creation. Neither is negotiable. There is a quality to the Jubilees reading of the Sabbath that is worth slowing down for, because it does something unusual in the ancient religious world. Most ancient traditions locate the authority of their religious practices in a founding event, a moment in time when the practice was established by a god or a prophet or a lawgiver in response to specific historical circumstances. The Sabbath, in the standard understanding of the Mosaic law, originates in the creation narrative. God rested on the seventh day, and therefore the Israelites are commanded to rest on the seventh day. This is a theological grounding, and it is a deep one. But it still locates the Sabbath in history, in the narrative of creation, which happened at a particular moment. In Jubilees, the Sabbath is something different. It is not primarily a command given at creation. It is a practice that was already taking place before the command was given, practiced by the angels in heaven on the first seventh day, not because God told them to, but because the seventh day is intrinsically holy, holy in itself, holy in the structure of time. The command to observe the Sabbath, which appears later in the Mosaic law, is not establishing something new. It is transmitting to human beings the knowledge of something that was already true. This distinction matters more than it might appear to. The difference between observe the Sabbath because I command you to, and observe the Sabbath because the seventh day is holy in the structure of the universe, is a difference in what kind of thing the Sabbath is. The first is a legal obligation. The second is an alignment with reality. In the second reading, to observe the Sabbath correctly is not merely to obey, it is to be in tune with the created order. And to fail to observe it, or to observe it on the wrong day, is not merely disobedience. It is a form of being out of step with the rhythm built into the fabric of time itself. You can feel the force of this if you hold it gently enough. The idea that the universe has a rhythm, and that there are practices which put you in alignment with that rhythm, and that the alignment matters in some way deeper than compliance with a rule, that idea has an appeal that is not limited to any particular religious tradition. It is the appeal of harmony, of being, for at least one day in 7, in the right relationship with the structure of time, rather than merely moving through it. And now, before we move on, the garden one more time, and a detail that shows just how completely the author of Jubilees sees Genesis and the later legal codes as a single continuous document. When Adam is placed in the garden, Genesis tells you he was in the eastern part first, outside the inner sanctuary, so to speak, before being brought to the full garden. Jubilees notices this. And Jubilees also notices Leviticus 12, which specifies the periods of ritual purification required for a woman after childbirth, 40 days for a male child, 80 days for a female. And the author makes a connection that Genesis never makes explicit, but which Jubilees presents as having always been implicit. In Jubilees, Adam spends 40 days in the outer eastern part of the garden before entering the full garden. Eve spends 80 days. These are the purity periods from Leviticus, applied to the very first moments of human creation. The law given to Israel in the wilderness was already operating in the Garden of Eden, before Moses was born, before the Exodus, before Sinai. The garden, retroactively, becomes a sanctuary with purity rules, a holy place that had to be entered correctly, in a way that Leviticus will only articulate more explicitly much later in the story. Genesis and Leviticus, in the reading of Jubilees, are not two different texts from two different periods. for two different purposes. They are one continuous document, one law, operating at every scale across all of time. If you understand the law that Leviticus describes, you understand something that was true in the Garden of Eden. And if you understand the garden, you understand why Leviticus says what it says. The thread running through all of this, the 7 years, the angels resting on the first Sabbath, the purity periods already operating in Eden, is a single profound conviction that the world was made according to a plan that predates the world itself. That the law is not human in origin, not given at a particular historical moment to address a particular historical situation. The law is cosmic. It is written into the structure of time and space, the way mathematics is written into the structure of numbers. Not invented, not imposed, but there. Now, a plant for the rest of the night. This book does not claim to have been written by Moses. It claims to have been dictated to Moses. And it claims that what was dictated to him was copied from something older than Moses himself. Copied from tablets that existed in heaven before the world began. We'll come back to what that means and what it changes. And now, the first replay fact of the night. We mentioned it at the start, and now it's time to give it its full weight. Noah's wife has a name in Jubilees. Her name was Emzara. She was the daughter of Rechel, who was the son of Methuselah, which makes her Noah's cousin, part of the same extended family. The text gives you the year of their marriage, the specific week of years, the Jubilee period. She is not introduced as a detail in a genealogy or as a footnote to her husband's story. She is introduced as a person, with a name, a lineage, a date, and a place in the record of the world. Emzara, daughter of Rachel. Remember that name. It comes back at the very end of the night. And now, before we go into the question of what the book claims to be, hold one more plant. 364. That is a number we haven't explained yet. It sits at the center of everything. We've been spiraling toward it since the beginning, and will arrive there fully in the deepest part of tonight. But hold it for now. 364. That number is the reason this book exists. So a book that dates the creation of the angels and gives the Sabbath an origin before the world, that names Noah's wife and fits the law of purification into the Garden of Eden, and retroactively shows the patriarchs keeping festivals that won't be explained for centuries. What exactly does this book think it is? The framing device of Jubilees is specific, and it asks to be taken seriously on its own terms. At the very beginning of the text, Moses is on Mount Sinai. He has been called up the mountain by God, and the narrative opens at the moment just before the law is given. The pivotal moment in the entire Hebrew Bible's storyline. The moment when the covenant between God and Israel takes its full legal shape. But before any commandment is given, before Moses receives the tablets of stone, something else happens first. God speaks to the angel of the presence, the most senior class of angel in the celestial hierarchy, the angels who stand in the direct proximity of God and serve as intermediaries between the divine and the human, and gives a command: descend to Moses, dictate to him the complete history of the creation and everything that has happened from that first moment until now, all of it, from the beginning. The angel descends to Moses on the mountain. Moses listens. Moses writes. And the angel does not speak from memory or from personal knowledge of the events or from a celestial perspective on history. The angel reads from a source. That source is the heavenly tablets, documents that exist in heaven, that have always existed in heaven, on which the complete record of history is inscribed. Not merely the history of what has happened, but the history of what was always going to happen, written before the world began, complete and unalterable, a text that preceded the events it describes. The angel reads from the heavenly tablets. Moses transcribes. The Book of Jubilees is what Moses writes. This is a remarkable claim. Not a modest one, not the claim that a learned priest, working with the best of his knowledge and the depth of his tradition, sat down and expanded Genesis with careful scholarship. The claim is much stronger. The text being offered is not a commentary on Genesis, not a supplement or an expansion. It is the source, the authoritative account from which Genesis was condensed, the text that Moses was working from when he produced the shorter version we now call the Torah. In the logic of the book's own framing, Jubilees is not a response to Genesis. Jubilees is what came before. How should we read a claim like this? There are at least 3 serious approaches, and none of them cancels the others. The first is the historical reading. Scholars of the ancient Jewish world recognize the claim to divine dictation as a well-established literary convention of the period, not peculiar to Jubilees, but common across a wide range of texts from the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ. Many texts from this era attributed themselves to a higher authority than their actual human author, to Moses, to Enoch, to a patriarch, or to an angel speaking from heaven. Scholars call this pseudepigraphy in the broad sense, and it was a recognized genre convention in the literary culture of ancient Judaism, not a form of deception. When an author in the 2nd century BC framed a text as delivered by an angel from heavenly tablets, the intended audience understood this as a claim about the text's authority, not "this is my opinion" or "this is my scholarly reconstruction," but "this is the authoritative account transmitted from the ultimate source." The framing was the theological argument, expressed in the literary conventions everyone in that world would have recognized. In this reading, the author of Jubilees was not lying when they said the book came from an angel. They were saying, in the idiom their audience understood, "This is not my private interpretation. This is the truth, and the truth is not mine to own. It belongs to heaven, to the structure of creation, to what the tablets have always said." The second is the sectarian reading. Whatever genre conventions the framing employs, Jubilees takes sides in disputes that were very much alive and urgent in the 2nd century before Christ. The book is insistent, emphatic even, about certain legal positions, the absolute necessity of circumcision, the prohibition on marriage with people outside the covenant community, the correct and unchangeable observance of the Sabbath and the festivals, and, most urgently of all, the correct calendar. And it grounds all of those positions not in the Mosaic covenant, which in principle might be subject to later interpretation or adaptation, but in the structure of creation itself. These laws were on the heavenly tablets before Moses was born. They were observed by the angels before humanity existed. You cannot negotiate them away by appealing to changing circumstances, because they predate every circumstance and every interpreter. A note here, before we go further. The legal disputes that Jubilees addresses were disputes within the Jewish world of the 2nd century before Christ. Internal conflicts among different communities about how the tradition should be understood and lived. Tonight we are presenting those disputes as historical events, not taking sides in them, and certainly not mapping them onto any present-day context. The people who wrote and read and copied Jubilees were doing so in a specific historical situation that was their own, and the urgency of their questions belongs to their time. The third is the traditional reading. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the Book of Jubilees is scripture, not an interesting historical text to be studied, not a 2nd century composition to be analyzed in the context of its period. Scripture, the Word of God, transmitted through an angel to Moses on Sinai, as the book itself says. The Ethiopian Christian tradition has maintained this reading for 2,000 years. The Christians who hear Jubilees read in Ethiopian churches are not engaging with it as a historical document. They are receiving it as revelation. That reading has more claim to continuity than the scholarly one. It is the reading that kept the book alive through all the centuries when the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. It is the reading that inspired generation after generation of Ethiopian monks to carefully copy the Ge'ez text, to treat it as something that required preservation, to keep it in the center of their liturgical life, rather than relegating it to a shelf. Whatever modern scholarship concludes about authorship and date, the Ethiopian Church looked at Jubilees and saw something worth keeping, and they kept it. Tonight, nothing is an argument for one reading over the others. What tonight offers is the book itself, what it says, who wrote it, who read it, and why one community valued it so intensely that they made 15 copies. But to understand the valuing, you need to understand the world the book was written into. The 2nd century before Christ was a period of crisis in the Jewish world unlike anything in living memory. In the 60s BC, a Seleucid Greek king named Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, a title that tells you something about his self-conception, launched a systematic attempt to suppress the distinctive practices of Jewish life in Judea. He desecrated the Jerusalem temple, placing an altar to Zeus in the inner court. He forbade circumcision. He outlawed the Sabbath. He required participation in Greek religious practice. The crisis was existential, not just a political conflict, but a question about whether Jewish life, as a distinct form of human existence, organized around a particular covenant, a particular law, a particular God, would survive. The revolt against Antiochus, led by a priestly family called the Maccabees, eventually drove out the Seleucid forces and rededicated the temple in 164 BC. That rededication is what Hanukkah commemorates to this day. But the aftermath of the revolt was more complicated than the revolt itself. Victory raised questions the persecution had forced below the surface. What, exactly, does authentic Jewish practice require? Which aspects of the law are absolute, and which might be adapted to circumstances? How should the festivals be observed, and by what calendar? Different communities formed around different answers. One of those communities, the one for which Jubilees was most urgently needed, answered, "Nothing is negotiable. The law is inscribed in the structure of creation. The Sabbath was observed in heaven before we existed. The festivals were kept by the patriarchs before Moses was born. And the calendar, the correct calendar, the one written on the heavenly tablets, has exactly 364 days. That number, that is why the book was written, and we are almost there. But first, we need to go to the desert. There is a plateau above the western shore of the Dead Sea. You can still visit it. You can stand on it today, on that narrow finger of pale limestone, balanced on a cliff above a lake that sits more than 400 meters below sea level, the lowest point on the surface of the earth. The Dead Sea is too salty for fish, too dense for ordinary swimming. A human body floats in it without effort, held up by the minerals dissolved in the water at concentrations found nowhere else in the world. The air above it is slightly different from the air anywhere else. The barometric pressure measurably higher, the atmosphere a little thicker, a consequence of being so far below the level of the sea. On the plateau, bare limestone, bleached pale by thousands of years of desert sun, cisterns cut into the rock, still visible, their walls showing the careful hand of the people who carved them, the foundations of walls. The outlines of what was once a dining room, a meeting hall, a watchtower, a scriptorium, a room dedicated to the production and careful copying of texts. Everything above the foundations is gone, but the shape of a community is still there in the rock, if you know how to read it. This is Khirbet Qumran. A community lived here for roughly 2 centuries, beginning sometime around 150 BC, continuing with one significant interruption, ending in 68 AD, when the Roman legions came as part of the campaign against the Jewish revolt that would culminate 2 years later in the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. Before the Romans arrived, the people of the plateau hid their scrolls. They sealed them in clay jars, They carried them into the 11 caves that honeycombed the cliff face above the settlement, and they left. The jars stayed sealed in the dark for nearly 2,000 years. Who were these people? The oldest and most widely held view identifies them as Essenes, a Jewish sect described by several ancient writers, including Pliny the Elder, Josephus, and the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, as a community living in deliberate separation from mainstream Jewish society, practicing strict ritual purity, holding goods in common, dedicating themselves to intensive study of the law, and following a very precise interpretation of what the law required. Whether Essenes is exactly the right label for the Qumran community is debated among modern scholars. Some prefer different terms or more complex descriptions that acknowledge the possibility that the community's identity shifted over its long history. But whatever label you use, what the scrolls tell us about the community is clear. They had separated from Jerusalem because they believed Jerusalem had gone wrong. More specifically, they believed the temple had been corrupted, that the priesthood serving it was not legitimately appointed, that the festivals were being observed on the wrong days, according to the wrong calendar, and that it was impossible to maintain right standing with God while remaining embedded in a religious establishment they regarded as fundamentally compromised. So they went to the desert, to the cliff above the lowest lake on earth, and there they observed the law as they understood it, on what they believed were the correct days, by what they believed was the correct reckoning, while the world they had left continued to get it wrong. Imagine, for a moment, what it actually felt like to be there. The days in the Judean desert are hot even in the cooler months. The sun comes up fast and the air is dry in a way that parches the back of the throat within minutes of being outside. Water was precious, every drop collected in those cisterns, carefully managed across the months. The plateau offered almost no shade. If you stood at its edge and looked east, you saw the Dead Sea glittering below you, its surface too flat, too still, reflecting the sky with the precision of a mirror. Beyond it, the dark shapes of the Jordanian hills, nothing else for miles in any direction. In the evenings, the temperature dropped quickly. The desert is like that. No stored heat in the pale stone, no moisture in the air to hold the warmth. You could sit on the foundations of the dining hall after sunset and watch the stars come out over the sea. The stars in the Judean desert, without the ambient light of any city, were extraordinary, thick and dense in a way that people who have lived their whole lives near cities rarely see. The Milky Way was visible as a thing, not a name. The planets moved against the fixed stars in patterns that an attentive observer would have known by heart. And an attentive observer was exactly what this community was. Think about what a community like this actually looked like, day by day. The members of the community did not live in private rooms in the way that a modern monastery might house its monks. The living arrangements at Qumran appear to have been communal, meals taken together, property held in common, the days structured around shared rituals of prayer and study and work. New members underwent a period of probationary membership before being admitted to the full community, and admission required the surrender of private property into the common pool. The daily schedule was organized around fixed hours of prayer, in the morning, at midday, in the evening, at night, intervals that marked the rhythm of the day as the 7-day week marked the rhythm of the larger cycle. The work of the community included farming and craft production, the management of the water supply through the cistern system, and, centrally, fundamentally, the work of copying texts. The scriptorium was not peripheral to the community's life. It was one of its most important spaces. The production of scrolls, the careful and time-consuming work of pressing the right ink into precisely shaped letters on precisely prepared animal skin, was as much a form of religious observance as the hours of prayer. The text you copied was a text you engaged with in the deepest possible way, not reading for comprehension, but rendering each letter of a sacred document with your own hands. which required a quality of attention that ordinary reading did not. To copy the Book of Jubilees was to receive it, in the most physical sense possible, into your body and your day. And in a community like this, where every member knew exactly which day of the sacred year it was, where the calendar dispute that had brought them to the desert was the foundation of their entire existence, Jubilees was not a scholarly text to be consulted. It was a living document. It confirmed, in the words of the angel of the presence, dictating to Moses from the heavenly tablets, that the year they were living in was the year God had designed, that the Day of Atonement they were observing in the desert was the real Day of Atonement, that the Sabbath they kept, week after week, in the pale stone buildings above the lowest lake on earth, was the Sabbath that the angels had kept in heaven before the world began. They were, above all other things, a community organized around a calendar. This is the detail that the scrolls make impossible to miss once you know to look for it. The sectarian documents found at Qumran, the texts the community appears to have composed themselves, the ones that describe their internal life and their legal positions, and their understanding of their own purpose, are pervaded by calendar concerns. The community rule, which describes how the community was to be organized, is insistent on the correct timing of festivals. The Damascus document, which contains legal rulings for members living outside the central community, is similarly preoccupied, and among the fragments were dedicated calendrical texts of remarkable specificity, lists of the priestly courses and their rotation through the temple service, organized according to a particular reckoning of sacred time, a reckoning that was not the reckoning being used in Jerusalem. To understand why the calendar was worth going to the desert over, worth separating from the temple over, worth spending your life in the desert over, you have to understand what a calendar dispute meant in this world. In the ancient Jewish world, the festivals of the sacred year were not commemorations in the sense that most modern people understand commemoration, events to be remembered, reflected upon, marked with appropriate ceremony. They were encounters. Passover was not a memorial dinner for the Exodus. It was a re-participation in the night when the angel of death passed over the houses marked with blood, a night that existed not only in the past, but in a kind of perpetual present, accessible through correct observance at the correct time. The Day of Atonement was not a day of remembering that God forgives sins. It was the day on which sins were actually forgiven, the specific day, appointed in the structure of sacred time, on which the encounter between human guilt and divine mercy occurred. If you observed the Day of Atonement on the wrong day, a day that the correct calendar designated as an ordinary day, you had not atoned. You had performed a ceremony on a day when nothing was happening, while the actual Day of Atonement passed without anyone noticing it. This is not a minor technicality. In a world where you're standing before God, the forgiveness of your sins, the maintenance of the covenant between your people and the divine, all of it depended on observing specific practices on specific days. Being wrong about the days was not a small error. It was a failure of encounter. The door was there, and you were knocking on the wall beside it. Wave 1. The Find. The dominant calendar in the Jerusalem temple, the calendar that eventually became the standard Jewish calendar, was a lunar calendar. It tracked the months by the phases of the moon. A lunar month is approximately 29.5 days. 12 lunar months add up to approximately 354 days, about 11 days shorter than the solar year of roughly 365.25 days. To keep the lunar calendar roughly synchronized with the solar year, which was necessary because the agricultural festivals were supposed to correspond to actual seasons, the Jewish lunar calendar inserted an extra month 7 times in every 19-year cycle. The consequence of this system, for a community concerned about festivals falling on correct weekdays, is significant. When extra months are inserted periodically to align the lunar and solar years, The day of the week on which any given date falls becomes variable from one year to the next. Passover, the 14th of Nisan, might fall on a Monday in one year and a Friday 3 years later. The Day of Atonement, which falls on the 10th of Tishri, might fall on a Saturday, on the Sabbath itself, in certain years, creating the theological problem of two different sets of sacred requirements coinciding on the same day. For the community at Qumran, this was unacceptable. Not an inconvenience, a theological crisis. If the calendar was wrong, the festivals were being performed on incorrect days. If the festivals were performed on incorrect days, the encounters those festivals were designed to produce were not happening. The priesthood in Jerusalem, performing the Yom Kippur service on the wrong day with all the correct ceremony,
The
was not
discovery
actually
of these
securing
vessels,
atonement.
undisturbed for
They were,
millennia,
in a very literal
provides
sense,
an
missing
unprecedented
the day.
glimpse into the past.
When the community at Qumran went looking for evidence that the correct calendar, their calendar, the one they were using in the desert, was the divinely ordained one rather than a human invention, they found the Book of Jubilees. Roland DeVoe published the first Hebrew fragment identification in 1949. More came from Cave 2, Cave 3, Cave 4, the Great Cave 4, which yielded more textual material than all the other caves combined, and which appears to have functioned as the main library of the community, produced fragments of Jubilees in multiple manuscript hands from multiple periods. Cave 11 added more. When all the counting and identification was done, the total was approximately 15 manuscripts across 5 caves. And now we can pay the number we planted. 15 manuscripts of Jubilees at Qumran. In context, the Psalms are attested in approximately 36 manuscripts, the highest number of any text at the site. Deuteronomy has around 30, Isaiah around 22. Genesis itself, the book Jubilees retells, around 20. Most of the books of the Hebrew Bible appear in between 5 and 15 manuscripts
From
at the
this night
site.
forward you shall be
Jubilees,
called Ada,
with 15,
and you
is
Zillah.
in the same tier as
May
the
your
most
lives
read
be
books in
long
the
and filled
entire
with favor.
library. And Jubilees is not a book of the Hebrew Bible. It is not part of any Jewish or Christian canon except the Ethiopian one. At Qumran, a community valued it as intensely as they valued large portions of what the rest of the world would come to call the Bible. Because it gave them what they needed most, the answer, the number. 364. But something else is worth pausing over here, before we move on. 15 manuscripts means 15 different acts of copying. 15 times, someone at Qumran, or someone before them, in communities connected to Qumran, took fresh parchment and an ink stylus and worked through the whole text of Jubilees, word by word, column by column, over the days or weeks or months that copying a document of that length required. Each copy was an act of investment, of material cost, of hours that could have been spent on other things. The parchment was expensive, the ink was prepared carefully, the scribal labor was skilled and not casual. Every one of those 15 copies was someone deciding that Jubilees was worth that investment, worth the parchment, worth the hours, worth the space in a library that was obviously, carefully curated, not random accumulation, but a deliberate collection, assembled by people who knew what they wanted and why they wanted it. We'll arrive at the calendar fully, very soon. But first, let's sit with the human dimension of this book, because the community at Qumran read Jubilees for the calendar. But Jubilees gives you something else as well, something quieter, something the scribe in the Christian East understood centuries later, when they chose to copy not the calendar chapters but the names. The Syriac fragment in the British Museum, the one with the title, the one we opened with tonight, is not from Qumran. It is a medieval manuscript, copied somewhere in the Christian East, by a scribe who had access to a Syriac translation of Jubilees that no longer survives in complete form. Someone found the list of names in the text of Jubilees and copied it out separately. They labeled it, they named what it was. The scribe knew what they were doing. They were copying the most human element in the book, not the calendar chapters, not the legal argument about endogamy, not the celestial hierarchy. The names of women: Zara, wife of Noah, daughter of Rachel, son of Methuselah, the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's 3 sons, who board the ark with their husbands and survive the flood and become the founders of the post-diluvian world, named one by one with their lineages. The daughters of Adam and Eve, whose existence Genesis acknowledges in passing without ever introducing them, receive names in Jubilees. The mothers of the patriarchal sons are introduced as people, with identities and family connections and places in the chronology, not merely as functions in a genealogy. And beyond the immediate family of Noah, the book's naming instinct extends further. Cain's wife, the woman who appears without introduction in Genesis 4:17, receives a name in Jubilees. She is called Awan, and she is named as the sister of Cain himself, a genealogical detail that the author of Jubilees provides to solve the logical problem of who was available to marry in the first generation of human beings. Similarly, Seth's wife receives a name, Azura, another daughter of Adam and Eve. The gaps in the Genesis genealogy are filled in, one by one, with women who had lived and loved and survived and died without names, until the author of Jubilees decided that enough was enough. Why does Jubilees name these women? Several reasons work together. The first is structural. If every event in the book must be precisely dated, and if marriages are events that need dates, then the woman being married needs to be identified. You cannot record that Noah married in the 25th Jubilee without saying who he married. The naming follows necessarily from the chronological project. The second is legal. Jubilees is unusually insistent about endogamy, marriage within the family or the covenant community. The book presents marriage outside the community as a form of defilement, something that compromises the covenant relationship. To demonstrate that the patriarchs observed endogamy, you need to show the genealogical relationship between husband and wife, which requires naming the wife and giving her lineage so the relationship can be established. But the third reason is the one the medieval scribe understood when they chose what to copy. The naming insists that these women were real, that they had names, that the silence of Genesis on their names was a gap, a genuine absence, a silence where something should have been, and that the gap was worth filling. Not for the legal argument, not for the calendar, simply because a woman who survived the end of the world, who stepped off the ark onto the new earth and began again, should not pass through the record of that event without a name. Zara, that is who she was. Zara, daughter of Rachel. The pay for the whisper loop we planted. Remember the 7 years in the garden? Remember the sense of a text filling in what Genesis left out. With precision, with a specific number where Genesis had only silence. That impulse, the impulse to say, but there has to be more, is the same impulse that named Zara. The numbers and the names come from the same place. They come from a reader who could not stand the gaps. If you are still awake, if you followed us this far, from the British Museum to the caves above the Dead Sea, through the calendar dispute and the community in the desert, I want to ask you something quiet. Is there someone in your own family's story whose name nobody wrote down? A grandmother, a great-grandmother, someone further back, whose existence you know about only because of the person who came after them, but whose own name got lost along the way? Maybe the child survived, and the mother's name didn't. Maybe the photograph survived, and the label on the back didn't. Maybe you know the shape of the absence, but not what goes in it. If you know the name, leave it in the comments when this is done. If you don't, if they are only grandmother's mother, or the woman who came from the village, or someone whose face you've imagined without a name to attach to it, leave that too. The absence is as worth marking as the name. Someone thought Emzara should be known. Someone thought these gaps should not stand. That instinct is worth honoring wherever we find it. Let's go one level deeper. We've talked about the names. We've talked about the dates and the retroactively embedded lore. Now, the tablets. The heavenly tablets appear throughout Jubilees, not only in the opening framing where the angel descends to Moses. They are the book's recurring final appeal, the trump card that ends disputes, the authority to which the text returns whenever it needs to establish that something is beyond question. Whenever Jubilees asserts that a law is permanent, that a date is correct, that a practice cannot be modified, it grounds that assertion in the tablets. This is written on the heavenly tablets. This was fixed before the world began. The logic is precise and has real force. If a law is inscribed on tablets that existed before the creation of the world, then no human institution has the authority to alter it. Not the temple priesthood, not the rabbinical courts, not any king, council, or consensus of scholarly opinion. The law was not created to govern humanity. It was shared with humanity, transmitted from a source that predates human existence. Human beings' role in relation to it is not to manage or adapt it. Human beings' role is to observe it, as faithfully as the angels observed the Sabbath on the first seventh day.
We walked this path
is the
for 40
argument
years,
that licensed the
guided
existence
only by
of
the
the
flame
Qumran
within
community.
and the stars
They had not
above.
gone to the desert because they were marginal or eccentric or without standing in the tradition. They had gone to the desert because they believed, with the conviction that the heavenly tablets argument provides, that they were the ones observing the actual law on the actual correct days, while everyone else had gotten it wrong. And if everyone else had gotten it wrong, the standing of the institutions that everyone else maintained was irrelevant. The heavenly tablets didn't care about institutional authority. But the tablets do something else too, something quieter than the legal argument. In an ordinary historical account, events happen because of causes. People made choices. Circumstances converged. Outcomes resulted from the particular
It is written
pressures
here,
of particular moments.
the prophecy of the
History
one who
in this
shall
account
come,
is
bringing
contingent.
forth a
It could
new
have been
age.
otherwise. In Jubilees, history cannot have been otherwise. The heavenly tablets contain the complete record of everything that will happen and everything that has happened, written before the world began, complete and unalterable. The angel reading from the tablets to Moses is not describing a past that was once uncertain. The angel is reading from a document in which everything was always already fixed. Adam and Eve's fall was on the tablets before Adam breathed. The flood was on the tablets before
I
Noah
am
was
showing
born.
you the only way to
The covenant
neutralize
with
it
Abraham
without
was on the
destroying the
tablets
artifact.
before Abraham heard the
Pay
call.
close attention to this sigil.
There is a passage in
Things.
Jubilees that illustrates this sense of
This
time
collection represents
especially
a comprehensive
clearly.
history,
In the retelling of the
meticulously
story
preserved.
of the binding of Isaac, the moment when Abraham takes his son up the mountain, believing he is to sacrifice him, only to find a ram provided at the last moment, Jubilees adds something Genesis does not contain. It explains why the test was given. In Jubilees, the Prince of Mastamar, the celestial adversary, the accusing angel, comes before God and challenges God to test Abraham. He argues that Abraham loves his son more than he loves God. God does not believe this, but permits the test. It is a framing device that also appears in Job and in the prologue of certain later texts. What matters here is what this does to the reader's experience of the narrative. In Genesis, the test of Abraham is mysterious. God commands the sacrifice, and that is all the explanation offered. The reader of Genesis stands with Abraham, without any view behind the curtain. The test is simply present, simply happening, without visible cause or context. In Jubilees, the reader knows something Abraham does not. The reader knows, from the heavenly tablets, that this event was always going to happen this way. that the challenge was made, that God permitted it, that the ram was already, in some sense, waiting. Abraham walks up the mountain not knowing any of this, but the reader who understands the heavenly tablets, walks with him knowing that the ending is already fixed. It is a different kind of reading, a different relationship to the story. This is a different kind of time than the one most of us inhabit. It is not a comfortable one necessarily, not if you think about it too directly. But at this hour of the night, in the particular mode of attention that a slow and quiet dark brings, it has a certain strange appeal. The idea that everything that has happened was written somewhere, complete before it occurred, that nothing was accident, that the shape of the past was fixed in something that existed before the past did. The community in the desert found this stabilizing. If everything is on the tablets, then the correctness of your calendar is also on the tablets. You are not the marginal group. You are the ones the tablets describe, and everyone else is the deviation. The desert air, the pale stone, the stars over the Dead Sea, all of it was simply the setting for a life that the heavenly tablets had always said would be lived here. Before we go into the deepest room of tonight, let's stand back and look at Jubilees in the company it belongs to. It is not alone. It is not an anomaly, not an eccentric outlier. It is the most systematic surviving member of a whole literary family. And understanding the family helps you understand what you're looking at when you read the book. The closest relative found at Qumran is the Genesis Apocryphon, one of the original 7 scrolls found in Cave 1 in 1947, written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, and in a very different register. Where Jubilees works through the whole narrative of Genesis systematically, at the level of dates and lore and celestial hierarchy, the Apocryphon is more selective and more intimate. It gives the patriarchs a first-person voice. It lets them narrate their own stories, describe their own interior states, speak from the inside of events that Genesis describes only from the outside. Where Jubilees gives you precise dates for Abraham's departure from Ur, the Apocryphon gives you Abraham's dream the night before. The images and the fear and the instruction from God rendered in Abraham's own words, in a voice that sounds like someone waking in the middle of the night and trying to hold the shape of the dream before it dissolves. The Apocryphon gives you the moment Sarah crosses the border into Egypt, and the anxiety of Abraham watching the Egyptian officials notice her, and his whispered instruction that she should say she was his sister, and the specific features that made the Egyptians stop and look. Her hair, her face, the way she moved. Genesis compresses this into a few verses. The Apocryphon turns it into a scene. The reader of the Apocryphon is not receiving a timeline or a legal argument. The reader is standing in the room, hearing the voices. The 2 books share a project and a period. They are doing very different things within that shared space. And together they tell you something important. The impulse to expand Genesis was not a single kind of thing. It was a large space in which many different kinds of writing could occur, systematic and intimate, legal and lyrical, organized by dates and organized by voices. Further afield, Josephus, writing in Greek for a Roman audience at the end of the 1st century AD, after the destruction of Jerusalem, as a captive turned historian, trying to explain the Jewish world to the people who had just destroyed it. Josephus produced the Jewish Antiquities, a comprehensive history of the Jewish people from creation to his own time. His account of the early Genesis narratives does something structurally identical to what Jubilees does. He names the unnamed, supplies the motivations that Genesis omits, provides the emotional texture that the compressed text leaves out. He is doing Rewritten Bible for a Hellenistic audience, in Greek, centuries after Jubilees was composed in Hebrew, for a very different readership. The impulse is the same. The literary form has shifted to fit the new audience, but the basic conviction that the gaps in Genesis are real gaps and that someone should fill them has not changed. Further still, into the great collections of rabbinic midrash, the extended communal conversations about the biblical text that the rabbinic tradition gathered and edited over many centuries. The same impulse is everywhere. Who was Cain's wife? The rabbis have a tradition. How long were Adam and Eve in the garden? The rabbis have estimates. What was Abraham thinking in the years before he heard the first call to leave Ur? The rabbis have stories, imaginative, specific, carefully constructed stories that take the silence of the text seriously and fill it with plausible and illuminating detail. There is a quality to midrash that is hard to describe without reading it. The rabbis are playful and serious at the same time. They hold multiple answers to the same question simultaneously, not as conflicting views to be adjudicated, but as facets of a reality complex enough to require more than one account. Where was the light of the first day, before the sun existed? Several rabbis have answers. Several answers are offered, without any suggestion that only one can be right. The tradition does not require resolution. It requires engagement. The point is not to close the question, but to dwell in it, to turn it over, to see what it looks like from different angles, to discover what other questions it opens when you take it seriously. Jubilees is the oldest surviving systematic example of this impulse that we can actually read in full. It is not the beginning. There were surely earlier expansions of Genesis that have not survived, but it is the earliest complete instance we have, and it is the most ambitious. No other surviving text retells the whole narrative from creation to Sinai, in precise chronological order, with a fully worked out calendrical system running underneath it. What made Jubilees extraordinary, in the end, is not that it filled in the gaps. Every tradition eventually does that. What made it extraordinary is the particular shape of its survival. That 15 copies were sealed in clay jars in the caves above the Dead Sea, and that the Ethiopian church kept it alive in Ge'ez for 2,000 years, and that the caves were opened in 1947 and the parchment was still there. And what makes that survival especially striking is how completely unexpected it was. Nobody in 1946, the year before the shepherd threw the stone into the cave, knew that Jubilees had been among the most read texts in the library at Qumran. Nobody knew that it had survived in Hebrew. The assumption was that the Hebrew original was simply gone. What scholars had was the Ethiopic text and the fragments of other traditions. And then, in 1947, the clay jars were opened, and 15 manuscripts appeared, and what had seemed like a dead branch turned out to be still rooted somewhere underground, waiting. The discovery changed the scholarly understanding of Jubilees substantially. Before the scrolls, Jubilees was interesting primarily as evidence of the kind of expansive biblical interpretation that ancient Judaism had produced. After the scrolls, it was something more specific, evidence of a particular community, with a particular calendar, for whom this particular book had been not just interesting but essential. The 15 manuscripts were not random survivals. They were testimony. They said, "We needed this. We used it. We wore it out and copied it again. We believed it was the truth." There is something worth holding in that testimony at this hour of the night. The community that sealed those 15 copies in the clay jars in the caves above the Dead Sea believed they were preserving the correct account of sacred time. They believed they were in time with heaven when the rest of the world was not. They were wrong about that. Or at least, history did not vindicate them in any ordinary sense. The 364-day calendar did not become the standard. The community did not survive the Roman campaign. Jerusalem fell. The temple burned. The Dead Sea settlement was abandoned. The scrolls sealed. The jars left in the dark. And then, nearly 2,000 years later, the jars were still there. The parchment was still there. The book was still there. Not preserved by an institution or a tradition or a decision-making body. Preserved by the dryness of the desert air and the darkness of the cave and the quality of the clay. And underneath all of it, the names, the dates, the angels, the heavenly tablets, the genre and its family, there is one number that explains why this particular book survived in that particular desert with that many copies. A number the author keeps returning to, a number we planted at the beginning of the night and have been circling ever since. It is time to go in. 364. Say it slowly. There is no hurry at this point in the night. 364. That is the number of days in the year, according to the Book of Jubilees. Not as an estimate, not as an approximation, not as one position among several that the author considered and chose. As a cosmic fact, a number inscribed on the heavenly tablets, established by God after the flood, and dictated by the angel of the presence to Moses on Sinai as the correct reckoning of sacred time. After the waters of the flood recede and Noah steps off the ark onto the renewed earth, after God sets the rainbow in the clouds as the sign of the covenant, the text gives the calendar. The year shall have 364 days. This is written on the heavenly tablets. Observe it. Now, 364 has a property that matters more than its relationship to the actual length of the solar year. 364 divides exactly by 7, no remainder, no fraction. 364 divided by 7 is 52, exactly, cleanly, completely. 52 weeks in the year, every year. Let that arrive at its own pace, because what follows from it is everything. In a year of 364 days, in a year of exactly 52 weeks, every date falls on exactly the same day of the week, in every year, forever, without drift, without adjustment, without the intercalation that the lunar calendar required to keep the months roughly aligned with the seasons. If the 1st of Nisan, the first day of the first month, falls on a Wednesday this year, it falls on a Wednesday next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, for as long as the calendar runs. Feel what this means. Sit with it for a moment. Imagine a year in which every date is always on the same weekday. Not just this year, always. The 14th of the month is always the same day of the week, decade after decade, generation after generation, forever. The structure of the week and the structure of the year are in perfect, permanent alignment. The calendar doesn't drift, it doesn't require correction, it doesn't slip. It is the same shape every year, reliably, the way the 7 days of the week are reliably 7. Which means, if Passover falls on a Tuesday this year, it falls on a Tuesday every year. If the Day of Atonement falls on a Friday, it falls on a Friday every year. If the Feast of Weeks falls on a Sunday, it falls on a Sunday every year. The festivals do not drift across the weekdays. The sacred moments do not shift. They arrive on the same weekday, at the same position in the week's rhythm, as reliably as the Sabbath arrives on the 7th day, because, in this calendar, the Sabbath always arrives on the 7th day, and the festivals always arrive on their designated days, and the two never collide. And at Qumran, the year began on a Wednesday. Not arbitrarily, deliberately. The 4th day of the week, Wednesday, by our reckoning, is the day on which God, according to Genesis, created the sun and the moon and the stars. Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate day from night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times, and days and years. The great lights, the instruments of time, the things that make it possible to count at all, were made on the 4th day. So the year, the cycle of sacred time, begins on the day the instruments of time were made. The first of the first month is always Wednesday, because Wednesday is the day time itself was organized. From that Wednesday, the whole calendar unfolds with mathematical precision. Passover, the 14th of Nisan, falls always on a Tuesday. The Feast of Weeks, the 15th of the 3rd month, falls always on a Sunday. The Day of Atonement, the 10th of Tishri, falls always on a Friday. Tabernacles, beginning on the 15th of Tishri, starts always on a Wednesday. These are not flexible approximations, not average positions across a range of years. They are fixed coordinates in a sacred year that never varies. The months themselves follow a structure that supports this precision. Jubilees divides the year into 4 quarters of 13 weeks each, 91 days per quarter. Each quarter begins on a Wednesday, the day that corresponds to the first day of creation's 4th day, the day the sun and moon were made. The first month of each quarter has 31 days. The second and third months have 30 days each. 3 months, 31 plus 30 plus 30, 91 days, 13 weeks exactly. 4 quarters, 4 times 91, 364 days, 52 weeks. The arithmetic closes perfectly, every time. There is something almost hypnotic about this structure when you hold it in your mind at sufficient length. The calendar is a machine for making time regular. In a lunar calendar, every month begins fresh at a new moon. But the relationship between the date and the weekday shifts from year to year, sliding slowly, never settling into a fixed pattern. In the 364-day calendar, the relationship between date and weekday is fixed permanently. The grid of the week and the grid of the year are synchronized forever, the way gears mesh when the teeth are exactly the right size. Nothing slips, nothing shifts. Every year is the same year in terms of its internal structure as every other year. The years repeat not just in their seasons but in their days, in the precise position of every Sabbath and every feast within the 7-day cycle. For a community that was organized primarily around the observance of sacred time, a community that had gone to the desert because they believed the rest of the Jewish world was not observing sacred time correctly, this kind of calendar was not merely convenient, it was theological. A calendar that never drifted was a calendar that could be trusted. A calendar that could be trusted was a calendar that could, in principle, have been given by God rather than invented by human beings. And Jubilees said, "It was." The angel of the presence, reading from the heavenly tablets, told Moses, "The year has 364 days. This is not an approximation. It is not a compromise. It is what the tablets say." And here is the detail that made this calendar more than a mathematical preference. In a year of exactly 52 weeks, the Sabbath never coincides with a feast day. Because the feast days fall on specific weekdays that are not Saturday, and the Sabbath is always Saturday, and both of those facts are permanent, the collision that the lunar calendar occasionally produced, 2 sacred obligations on the same day, requiring difficult legal decisions about precedence, simply cannot occur. The calendar prevents it structurally. Every Sabbath is only a Sabbath. Every feast day is only its feast day. They exist in their own designated spaces, week after week, year after year, without ever impinging on each other. Feel what this would have meant to the community on the plateau above the Dead Sea. You have gone
Thus
to the
king
desert
decreed
specifically
that all
because you
subjects
believe the
must
rest of
register
the
their
religious
lands
world is
and pay
observing
the
the
tribute
festivals
in
on
the
the wrong
appointed month.
days. You have given up the proximity of the temple, the social fabric of Jerusalem, the ease of belonging to the mainstream, all because you are convinced the mainstream calendar is wrong. And then you find, in the Book of Jubilees, in a text inscribed on heavenly tablets, dictated by the angel of the presence, recorded by Moses on Sinai, a year of exactly 52 weeks, in which every festival falls on the same weekday forever, in which the Sabbath and the feast days never collide, in which the whole structure of sacred time is as stable and as permanent as the structure of the week itself. You have not gone to the desert in error. You have gone to the desert because the error was in Jerusalem. The 364-day calendar in Jubilees is not an isolated claim. It appears across a whole family of related texts. The astronomical book of 1 Enoch, the section, chapters 72 through 82, in which the angel Uriel explains to Enoch the movements of the sun and moon through the gates of heaven, specifies a year of exactly 364 days. The angel takes Enoch on a journey through the chambers where the winds are kept, through the gates in the eastern and western horizons, through which the sun and moon rise and set at different seasons. The whole elaborate tour, with its precise measurements and its cataloguing of the cosmic machinery, ends up at the same place Jubilees ends up. A solar year of 364 days, organized into 4 equal quarters, beginning on the day the instruments of time were made. The astronomical book of 1 Enoch is widely considered, on the basis of its language and literary features, to be one of the oldest surviving pieces of Jewish literature outside the Hebrew Bible itself, possibly composed as early as the 3rd century before Christ, which would make it older than Jubilees. If that dating is correct, then Jubilees did not invent the 364-day calendar. Jubilees inherited it, systematized it, and made it the foundation of its entire chronological argument. And the calendrical documents the Qumran community appears to have composed themselves, the lists of priestly courses, the rotation schedules for temple service, are organized around the 364-day year. The temple in Jerusalem had always rotated the priestly service through 24 priestly families in a regular cycle. The Qumran documents preserve a version of this rotation system, but organized around the 364-day year rather than the lunar one, with each priestly family serving at predictable, fixed intervals that the 364-day structure makes permanently stable. They were not eccentric. They had an astronomy text, a legal text, their own community documents, and the rotation of the priestly families, all saying the same thing. The only question was whether they were right. Now, the honest part. 364 is short of the actual solar year. The solar year is approximately 365.25 days. A 364-day year drifts against the solar year by approximately 1.25 days annually. In 10 years, more than 12 days. In a century, more than 100. In 3 centuries, a 364-day calendar drifts so far against the actual seasons that a springtime festival occurs in summer. This is not a small problem if the agricultural festivals are supposed to correspond to actual seasons. Scholars have proposed several explanations for how the Qumran community handled this. Some argue that they added intercalary weeks periodically, extra weeks inserted into the calendar to correct the drift, in a way that preserved the 52-week structure while keeping the calendar roughly in line with the solar year. Others argue that the community was tracking a schematic sacred cycle that was deliberately independent of the solar year, that they accepted the drift as an acceptable feature of adherence to the heavenly reckoning, rather than an error to be corrected. Still others simply acknowledge that the texts don't tell us clearly, and that we should not pretend otherwise. This is an honest uncertainty. The documents we have tell us what calendar they used and why they believed it was correct. They do not tell us with any clarity how they managed the practical problem of a year that was slightly too short. That gap in our knowledge, appropriately enough, given what we've been talking about tonight, is a gap. What we can say is this: the community continued to use this calendar for as long as the settlement existed. 2 centuries of desert life, organized around 52-week years and festivals on fixed weekdays. They did not abandon the principle. The Day of Atonement fell on a Friday by the reckoning of the heavenly tablets, and on a Friday they observed it. Imagine the plateau on a Friday in early autumn, the Day of Atonement. The coldest the desert gets at that hour of the year is just barely beginning to be felt. The nights have started to cool. The days are still hot, but the edge of something new is in the air. In the community's buildings on the plateau, the observance is underway. The fasting, the prayer, the rituals of atonement, the specific practices the law requires on this specific day. The clay beneath your fingertips is cool at this hour of the evening, even though the sun was fierce all afternoon. The stone holds almost nothing. You sit in the foundations of the dining hall where they would have gathered, and you watch the last of the light leave the sky over the hills to the west, and the stars begin their slow arrival one by one over the Dead Sea to the east. And 30 miles northwest, in Jerusalem, the temple is conducting its own Day of Atonement service. On a different day, on a day that the lunar calendar specifies and the community at Qumran regards as an ordinary day. A day when, by the reckoning of the heavenly tablets, no encounter with God is occurring. No atonement is being secured. No door is open. The community in the desert is certain, absolutely certain, that they are the ones who have found the day, that they are the ones knocking on the right door, that they alone, in the desert above the lowest lake on earth, are in time with heaven. There is something both troubling and moving about that certainty, depending on where you stand. Troubling, because history is full of small, isolated groups who believed everyone else was wrong and only they had the truth. And the record of those groups is not reassuring. Moving, because behind the certainty is a real conviction that the encounters the festivals were designed to produce depended on precision, that the encounters were real and not merely symbolic, and that the stakes of being wrong about the day were not a matter of convention. The stakes were whether God was present or not. The calendar was not the whole of Jubilees, but the calendar was the central reason Jubilees existed. The urgent, practical, immediate reason that a community in the desert needed this book in their library, needed it in 5 different caves, needed 15 copies. Everything else, the names, the dates, the angelic hierarchy, the retroactively embedded law, the heavenly tablets themselves, was the foundation on which the calendar argument rested. And the calendar argument was the reason 15 copies of the book were sealed in the caves and carried into the dark when the Romans came. Let's come back to the surface now and answer the question we asked at the beginning of the night. What does the Book of Jubilees actually add to Genesis? After everything we have walked through, the 7 years in the garden, the angels on the first Sabbath, the names, the caves, the calendar, let's say it plainly and in order. It adds names for women who had no names. Noah's wife, whose name in Jubilees is Emzara, daughter of Rachael, introduced with a lineage and a date and a place in the chronology. The wives of the sons of Noah, who board the ark with their husbands and survive the flood and become the mothers of the post-Diluvian world, are named in Jubilees one by one. The daughters of Adam and Eve, whose existence Genesis acknowledges in passing without introducing them, receive names. The mothers of the patriarchal sons are introduced as people, not as functions. Someone believed the names mattered. Someone believed that the women who survived the end of the world, the women who became the mothers of the nations, deserved to be known. That belief is preserved in the British Museum, in a Syriac fragment with a quiet title. It is preserved in the monastery libraries of Ethiopia, in Ge'ez manuscripts copied and recopied across 15 centuries. It is preserved in the fragments sealed in clay jars in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. It adds dates. The 7 years in the garden, the year of Noah's marriage to Emzara, the year of the call of Abraham, the year of the binding of Isaac, the year of Jacob's journey into Egypt. Everything is placed in the continuous chronology of Jubilee periods and weeks of years, running from the first day of creation. The dates are not decorative, they are the argument. Time has a shape, history has a structure, and the shape and the structure were written on heavenly tablets before the world began. It adds an angelic hierarchy. The angels of Jubilees are not vague presences at the edges of the narrative. They are organized, ranked, given domains, present at the creation of the world. The angel of the presence dictates the complete history from the heavenly tablets. The angels observe the first Sabbath, The Watchers, the angels who come to earth and take human wives, a story Genesis tells in 4 compressed verses, receive a fuller account in Jubilees, with causes and consequences that the original omits. It embeds the law in creation itself. The Sabbath was observed in heaven before humanity. The festivals were kept by Noah and Abraham before Moses was born. The laws of ritual purity were operating in the Garden of Eden. The law did not begin at Sinai. It was written into the structure of the world on the first day of creation, and Sinai was the moment when Moses received, from the angel of the presence, the written record of what had always been true. And it gives the calendar, 364 days, 52 weeks exactly, every festival on the same weekday, every year, forever. The Sabbath and the feast days never colliding, written on heavenly tablets, established after the flood, confirmed in the astronomical Book of Enoch, in the community's own calendrical documents, in the whole library that the community sealed in the caves. The calendar is the point. Everything else, the names, the dates, the angels, the embedded law, is the scaffolding on which the calendar argument rests. Now let's talk about what happened to the book, and why its survival is almost as improbable as its original composition. After Qumran, after the Romans came in 68 AD, and the settlement was destroyed, and the scrolls were hidden, and the community dispersed or killed, the book had 2 completely separate lives, running in parallel for nearly 2,000 years. The first life was in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church had its origin in the 4th century AD, when Christianity came to the kingdom of Aksum in what is now northern Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church developed its own distinctive canon, which included texts that other Christian traditions eventually set aside, the books of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and several others that the Western and Eastern churches came to regard as outside the canon. In Ethiopia, these were not regarded as optional or peripheral. They were scripture. The monks who copied Jubilees were not preserving a historical curiosity. They were copying the Word of God with the care and the continuity that scripture receives. The transmission of the text through the Ethiopian church is a story of extraordinary continuity. Monastery after monastery, century after century, in the highlands of Ethiopia and in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, in the ancient city of Aksum, and in the scriptoria of Lalibela, the text was copied, generation by generation, by scribes who may not have known or cared about the calendar debate that had originally made Jubilees so urgently necessary to a community in the Judean desert. They copied it because it was scripture, because the tradition said it was scripture, because the tradition had always said so, as far back as anyone could trace. And the tradition was right to say so, in its own terms, because the Ethiopian church had inherited the text through channels we can still partially reconstruct, running back through earlier African and Near Eastern Christian communities to the Greek translation of the Hebrew original, a translation that was made early enough that fragments of it survived to be quoted by the early church fathers. The Ethiopian church kept the Book of Jubilees alive in Ge'ez for 1,500 years after the rest of the world had forgotten it existed. They copied it in monastery after monastery, generation after generation, in a tradition of preservation that never wavered. When European scholars discovered the book in the 19th century, the Ethiopic text was what they found, a translation of a translation, from Hebrew to Greek to Ge'ez, but a faithful one, as it turned out. The second life was in the desert. The 15 manuscripts sealed in the 5 caves above the Dead Sea stayed in the dark through the Roman period, through the Byzantine period, through the rise of Islam, through the Crusades, through the Ottoman Empire, through the British Mandate, through the founding of the modern state of Israel, in the dark, in sealed clay jars, in the extremely dry air of the Judean desert, for close to 2,000 years. When those jars were opened, and the manuscripts were identified, and the scholars compared the Hebrew fragments from the caves to the Ethiopic text in the Ethiopian church libraries, they found something remarkable. The two traditions matched. The Ge'ez text that the Ethiopian monks had been copying for 1500 years corresponded closely to the Hebrew manuscripts that had been sealed in the desert for 2000 years. The book was transmitted faithfully across an almost incomprehensible distance of time and language and geography. Two completely separate transmission histories, one alive and active in the liturgical life of a church, the other frozen in a sealed clay jar in the desert, had preserved the same text. Think for a moment about what that correspondence required. The Ethiopian monks who copied Jubilees in the 12th century had no access to the Hebrew fragments in the Judean desert. The clay jars had been sealed for more than 1,000 years before any of them were born, and yet when the Hebrew text emerged from the desert in 1947 and was compared to the Ge'ez text that the Ethiopian church had been protecting, the two versions of the story matched. The same events, the same numbers, the same names. Emzara, daughter of Rachel, wife of Noah, still there in both versions, named in the desert manuscript and named in the monastery manuscript, separated by 2,000 years and 2,000 miles. This is the same story that one Enoch tells, also preserved in Ge'ez by the Ethiopian church, also found in Hebrew fragments at Qumran, also confirmed by the comparison to have been faithfully transmitted. Both books are sisters, sharing the 364-day calendar, sharing the heavenly tablets, sharing the improbable path from the Judean desert to the Ethiopian monasteries and back. The Ethiopian church kept the books that the rest of the world forgot, and the desert kept the Hebrew originals, and both survived until 1947, when the shepherd found the cave and the jar had not broken. The question of what the Ethiopian canon means, why it is different from the Western and Eastern Christian canons, and why its difference matters, is worth pausing on for a moment, because it opens onto something larger than this particular book. The process by which certain texts were included in the Christian biblical canon and others were set aside was not a single event. It was a long process, taking place over several centuries in different communities, with different traditions and different concerns, and it produced different results in different places. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century, the councils and synods that debated canon in the West, the decisions made by influential theologians whose views eventually became normative. These shaped the canon that most of the Christian world eventually came to regard as authoritative, but they shaped it for specific communities, in specific historical moments, responding to specific concerns. The process was never universal, and some communities maintained traditions that diverged from the emerging consensus. The Ethiopian church was one of those communities. Geographically and culturally somewhat removed from the main centers of these debates, the Ethiopian church preserved a broader canon, a canon that had been transmitted to them in an earlier period, before the narrowing that occurred in other traditions, and that they saw no reason to revise. They were not preserving heterodox material. They were preserving the tradition they had received, which happened to include texts that other traditions eventually set aside. This matters for Jubilees specifically because it means the Ethiopian preservation was not marginal or eccentric within the Ethiopian context. Jubilees was not kept alive in Ethiopian monastery libraries as a curiosity or an oddity. It was kept alive as scripture, read in the liturgy, cited in theological discussion, copied with the same care and attention as the books of Moses and the Psalms. The monks who preserved it were not preserving an interesting historical document. They were preserving something they encountered every year in the course of their regular worship, something they heard read aloud, something they considered the Word of God. When European scholars in the 19th century began to piece together what Jubilees actually was, when the German scholar August Dillmann published his landmark Ethiopic edition of Jubilees in 1859, providing the Western scholarly world with its first comprehensive access to the text, they were not discovering something that had been hidden. They were discovering something that had been continuously present, continuously alive, in the Ethiopian church for 1500 years. The discovery was European scholars catching up to a tradition that had never lost the thread. What remains true regardless of your position on the theological questions, regardless of what you believe about the heavenly tablets, or the canonical status of the book, or the correctness of the 364-day calendar? Several things. Someone in the 2nd century before Christ cared deeply about the names of women who had been left unnamed in the most famous book in the world. They cared enough to name them systematically, to give them lineages and dates, to make them present in the record. That care was honored by every scribe who copied the book afterward, in the scriptorium at Qumran, in the monastery libraries of Ethiopia, in the scriptorium where the Syriac fragment was made. Someone cared deeply about the days, about whether the Day of Atonement fell on the correct Friday, about whether the encounter with God that the festival was supposed to produce was actually happening or was being missed because the calculation was wrong. They cared enough to write a long, complex, carefully structured book, a book that required years of work and deep knowledge of the tradition to prove that the correct day had always been the correct day. And 15 copies of that book were sealed in the caves when the Romans came. And the shepherd found the cave, and the jar had not broken, and the parchment was still there. One scholar described Jubilees as the most thorough act of curiosity in the ancient record. Not the most daring, not the most radical, not the most theologically contentious, though it is all of those things too. Not just the calendar argument, not just the legal positioning, the whole project. A reader encountering a compressed and ancient text, sensing in the gaps something that should not be missing, and deciding to fill those gaps in with the greatest possible care and precision. That is curiosity in its most ancient and most recognizable form. The curiosity that could not stand not knowing how long, not knowing what her name was, not knowing what number. You do this. Not with ancient texts, maybe, not with the Book of Genesis specifically, but you do this. You have always done it, and the chances are you've been doing it tonight without quite realizing, filling in the spaces around what was said, completing the shape of things that were only partially offered. Every time you hear a story that ends too quickly, every time a name is left out of a sentence where a name should be, every time a narrative you've been following makes a jump from one point to another and leaves you standing in the space between, something in you reaches to fill it in, automatically, without instruction, without deciding to. The gap creates a kind of low, persistent awareness, not painful, just present, the feeling of something unfinished, and the mind finds something to put in it, an inference, a guess, a plausible detail borrowed from a similar story, or from the emotional logic of what someone in that situation would most likely have felt. You cannot leave a story with a hole in it. Something goes into the hole, and then, usually, you forget you put it there. Think about the half-told family story you have been carrying for years, the one with a missing middle. An ancestor who came from somewhere and ended up somewhere else.
Theirs was a time
and the journey
of wandering,
between, the
a swift
reasons,
journey
the
through
weeks
the
of travel,
wilderness towards the
first
promised
morning
land,
in an unfamiliar
guided
city,
by the setting
the
sun.
feeling of stepping off the boat or the train and understanding, for the first time, that this new place was going to have to become home, has simply vanished. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody who knew the story firsthand is still alive to tell it. And yet, somewhere in your mind, there is a version of that journey. You assembled it from the edges of what you actually know, from the geography, from the period, from what you understand about why people left and what the crossing cost them. It has become, over time, something you could almost call a memory. You couldn't find the seam in it even if you tried. The reconstruction has become the story. Or perhaps there is a photograph. You have probably seen it, the old photograph, the one that has been passed down through enough hands that nobody living can identify everyone in it with certainty. A family group, formally posed, in clothes that belong to a particular decade in the past. You know some of the faces, and for others, you have names without faces, or faces without names, and there is usually one figure, standing slightly to the side, or seated at the edge of the frame, about whom you know almost nothing. A name perhaps, if you're lucky, a relationship in the family. And from those two pieces of information, you have built a person. You know, without being able to say exactly when you decided, what this person was probably like. Something about the posture, the expression, the particular quality of stillness in someone who did not enjoy being photographed. You have filled in the rest. This is not a failure of historical rigor. This is how human minds engage with incomplete narratives. We are pattern-completing creatures, and stories are patterns, and a pattern with a gap in it will not simply stay gapped in the mind of the person holding it. The mind inserts something. Sometimes the insertion is accurate, sometimes it isn't, and usually you can't tell the difference from the inside. The author of Jubilees felt this about Genesis, felt the gaps as genuine absences, as silences where something should be, as questions that the most important book in their world had left unanswered. And they answered them, systematically, carefully, over years of work that required deep familiarity with the tradition. The gaps that needed filling most urgently, in their view, were the calendar gaps, the places where Genesis implied a structure of sacred time without specifying it clearly enough to settle the disputes of the day. Those gaps were filled with the heavenly tablets, with the angel of the presence, with 364 days and a year beginning on a Wednesday. But the names are different. The names were filled in not because they were theologically urgent, they were filled in because they were humanly necessary. Because a woman who survived the end of the world should have a name in the record of what happened. Because the compression of Genesis, however theologically necessary, had left out something that the author of Jubilees could not in conscience leave out. Noah's wife was called Zara. That is the most human sentence in the Book of Jubilees. Not the calendar, not the angels, not the heavenly tablets. The name of a woman who survived the flood. Someone sat with the text of Genesis and thought, but what was her name? And then found out, or decided, and wrote it down. Human beings cannot leave a story with a hole in it. We patch it, and then we forget we patched it. The Book of Jubilees is that impulse, written down 2,000 years ago, preserved across an improbable chain of transmission. Hebrew scroll to Greek translation, to Ge'ez codex, to Ethiopian monastery, to Syriac fragment in a London museum, and Hebrew scraps in a desert cave. Preserved long enough and carefully enough that we can read it tonight and watch the impulse at work and recognize it. That is not a small thing. It is in fact one of the more quietly astonishing things about the long human enterprise of writing and preserving, that this book, written in a particular crisis moment in a particular community's life, filled with arguments about a calendar dispute that most of the world has never heard of, also happened to contain a list of names. And someone, somewhere in the long chain between the 2nd century before Christ and the glass case in London, recognized that the list of names was the part worth pulling out, the part worth copying on its own, the part worth giving a title. If tonight has given you something worth keeping, a name you hadn't heard before, a number that surprised you, a question you hadn't asked before about the way the people before us navigated the silences in their most sacred texts, you can let the small algorithm know by pressing the like button gently when this is done. It is a quiet signal. It says, "More of this, please. If tonight is your first night here, you can subscribe. It is a small commitment, and it means the next long, slow journey through an old story will find you." The comments are still open. The location question is still waiting. Where in the world are you tonight? And what hour is it? And I do read them. Someone in a city I've never been to will leave a note in the morning, and I will imagine them there, in their own particular dark, in the hour that was theirs when this reached them. The membership is there for those who want to go further in, completely optional. Watching and listening and resting here tonight is already more than enough. Come back to the beginning. The British Museum, a small glass case in a gallery that sees fewer visitors than it deserves. The museum is closed at this hour. The last visitors left long ago, and the building has settled into the particular quiet of an institution at night. Not silent exactly, but the sounds are different. The footsteps are gone, the voices are gone, and what's left is the hum of the climate control systems and the very faint sound of a large building doing what large buildings do when they are alone. The lights that stay on through the dark hours cast a low, even glow on the cases and the glass and the objects inside them. You can imagine walking those corridors now, in the particular quiet of a museum after closing. The way the sound of your own footsteps seems louder than it should. The way the objects in the cases seem to have a different quality of presence when no one else is there to look at them. Not eerie exactly, more like complete. The objects are doing what they have always done, in the quiet, which is simply to exist. They don't require an audience. They have been existing for a very long time without one. And in one of those cases, there is a fragment of parchment. A piece of manuscript written in Syriac, old, worn at the edges. A few lines of careful writing, the ink faded in places to amber. Most ancient fragments don't have titles. This one does. Names of the wives of the patriarchs, according to the Hebrew books called Jubilees. Somebody wrote that title. A very long time ago, in a scriptorium somewhere in the Christian East, a scribe with access to a Syriac translation of Jubilees went through the book and found the list of names and copied it out and gave it a title that announced exactly what it was. Not the calendar chapters, not the legal argument about endogamy, not the celestial hierarchy or the heavenly tablets or the precise date of the expulsion from Eden. The names of the women. Because Emzara, daughter of Rachiel, wife of Noah, survivor of the flood, mother of the post-Diluvian world, she should not pass through history as the wife of Noah. She was a person, she had a name, and somebody, at every point in the long chain of transmission from the 2nd century before Christ to that medieval scriptorium to the glass case in London, agreed she should not be nameless. The calendar can wait until morning. 364 divisible by 7, the year beginning on a Wednesday. That can wait. The heavenly tablets can wait. The caves above the Dead Sea, sealed again now that their contents have been carried to laboratories and reading rooms. Those can wait. The dispute between Jerusalem and the desert, so urgent that it required a full retelling of the history of the world to address. That dispute is 2,000 years behind us, and it can wait. The questions can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. Let the room be what it is, your room, at this hour, the particular sound of it, the particular quality of the dark. You don't need to hold any of this carefully. You can let it go. The pieces will still be there if you want them in the morning. The 14-minute mark and the 15 manuscripts, the 7 years in the garden and the name of the woman who stepped off the ark. They will wait. Noah's wife was called Emzara. Somebody made sure we would know. For now, you can rest.